Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Subways run beneath the world, fast, loud, and always moving. But when the train is nearly empty and the lights flicker between stations, you start to notice what shouldn't be there, sitting just a few seats away. I worked the Marunouchi line for many years. Yotsuya Station was my regular assignment during mid-shift, and over time, I got used to the rhythms of the job. Commuters came and went, trains arrived down to the minute, and we monitored the platforms for anything out of the ordinary. Most days blended into each other. That summer in 2013, however, broke the pattern in a way I never expected. It began with what I thought was a routine passenger report. A woman approached the station office to mention that a girl had been standing close to the edge of platform 2. She didn't seem alarmed, just concerned enough to mention it. A few minutes later, 2 more passengers came forward and described the same thing. A girl wearing a school uniform standing very near the yellow safety line. She wasn't behaving erratically, they said. She just stood completely still. I decided to check the surveillance feed. It didn't take long to spot her. She was facing the tracks, standing almost directly at the center of the platform. She looked to be a teenager, wearing a standard high school uniform. Navy skirt, white blouse, dark shoulder bag. Her posture was completely upright, arms resting loosely by her sides. She didn't turn her head, didn't move her feet, didn't interact with anyone nearby. Her eyes were locked forward, focused on the tunnel where the trains arrived. I watched the footage carefully, waiting to see her do something, adjust her weight, glance sideways, but nothing changed. Curious, I rewound the feed to see when she had arrived. At 14:11, she entered the frame, walked toward that exact position, and stopped. For the next hour, she didn't take a single step. Crowds moved around her. Some passengers paused and gave her a sideways glance as they passed, but no one approached her. No one interrupted her strange, unwavering stillness. The more I watched, the more the footage felt unnatural. Not dramatic, just deeply off in a way that's hard to explain. There was no hesitation in her posture, no flicker of uncertainty or distraction. She wasn't waiting for a train like other commuters. She wasn't listening to music, checking a schedule, or watching her phone. She was entirely still, eyes trained on the tracks ahead. At exactly 15:12, a train entered the station. It was one of the older Marunouchi line models, the type still running with the slightly rounded windows and heavier carriage doors. As it pulled in, it blocked the camera's view of the girl. For 12 seconds, the section of the platform where she had been standing was hidden behind the train. When the train rolled away, she was gone. I paused the footage, replayed it, rewatched it in slow motion. She never stepped toward the doors. No one exited near that spot. The platform was partially busy, but she had been standing in a section with very little crowding. There were no obstacles that could have obscured her exit. She had not moved before the train arrived. She had not boarded the train. She had not walked away. When the train left, the space was empty. I checked all available footage from that platform, including every stairwell and exit point. No sign of her anywhere. No one matching her clothing or build had left the station. She hadn't boarded. She hadn't tapped out. It was as if she had never existed beyond those 12 seconds of obstruction. I contacted station security. Staff were sent to search the entire facility, every restroom, every maintenance corridor, every back entrance. Nothing turned up. The report I filed was kept formal and concise, but the truth of it unsettled everyone who watched the video. It wasn't just that she had vanished. It was that the footage offered no possible explanation for how. That evening, one of the senior conductors, a man who had worked the line for decades, visited the station office. Word had spread among staff that something strange had been captured on the platform feed. He asked to see the video. As soon as the footage played and the girl appeared on screen, his reaction changed. He stared at the monitor for a long time without speaking. When the train blocked her from view and the platform came back empty, he looked away. Later, he told me that the girl matched the description of someone he remembered from 5 years earlier. In 2008, there had been a fatal incident on that very platform. A schoolgirl had jumped in front of his train. He had never forgotten her face, or the position she had been standing in just before the impact. The uniform, the posture, even the way her arms had hung at her sides. All of it matched what we had seen on the feed. It happened in early August. The timing was almost exact. I confirmed the old report myself. The death had been ruled a suicide, and the area was closed off for most of that day. There were flowers placed at the spot for some time afterward, but eventually people stopped coming. The platform returned to its usual function, and commuters passed through without remembering what had happened there. After the incident with the footage, station management archived the video and issued an internal directive not to discuss it publicly. The file wasn't deleted, but it was secured behind administrative access. A few staff who had been on shift that day requested transfers. One of the new hires left the company entirely. I stayed in my role, but I avoided Platform 2 whenever possible. Something about the girl's stillness stayed with me. She hadn't been anxious. She hadn't paced or fidgeted or hesitated like someone making a decision. Her posture was calm, deliberate. She stood for exactly 1 hour, looking into the tunnel as train after train passed through, as though she were watching for something or remembering something. I don't have a name for what I saw. There are always ways to dismiss things. Camera errors, visual coincidences, tricks of memory. But this didn't feel like an error. I watched the footage too many times. I tracked every angle, checked every road out of that station. She never left. She also never arrived. She simply appeared and disappeared, as if repeating a moment that had already passed. Years later, I sometimes still think about that day. Not constantly, but in flashes. When a train pulls into a quiet platform and the crowd thins, I'll catch myself looking at the yellow line, just for a moment. Long enough to remember what it felt like to see someone standing there, unmoving, and then not there at all. I spent over a decade working night shifts for the MTA, most of it on the downtown 6 line running through Manhattan. It was the kind of work that made you familiar with silence in a way most people never really understand. After the passengers cleared out and the city fell into its quieter hours, the tunnels would settle into their own atmosphere. An endless series of flickering lights, stale air, and mechanical echoes that bounced off concrete and metal like whispers you could almost recognize. You learned to keep your focus tight and your thoughts even tighter. The darkness beneath the city wasn't just blackness. It was history, pressure, and sometimes something else entirely. In early 2006, I started hearing quiet talk among the crews about a man being seen in the tunnel near the old City Hall station. At first, the stories came from train operators finishing late runs who mentioned spotting someone walking along the inside edge of the tunnel wall. The descriptions were always similar. A tall figure wearing outdated MTA work gear with dulled reflective strips, walking alone in the early hours of the morning, always heading toward the curve of the abandoned loop, moving against the direction of train traffic. The detail that unsettled people the most wasn't just his presence in a restricted area. It was the way he moved. Everyone described him walking with a deliberate limp, dragging one leg slightly behind the other as though injured or stiff, yet continuing on with slow, determined steps. The first few reports were treated the way these things usually are, shrugged off as another homeless person navigating the service areas, someone who knew how to avoid cameras and avoid getting caught. These kinds of encounters weren't rare, especially near the older stations where security wasn't as tight and access points were easier to slip through. But there was something different about the way these sightings were being told. The tone in people's voices when they brought it up wasn't casual or dismissive. No one was laughing. They weren't telling ghost stories. They were just explaining what they had seen, and none of them seemed comfortable doing it. I had my own encounter a few weeks later. I was riding in the last car during a vibration test we were running overnight, not operating the train, but monitoring equipment during a full loop run through the City Hall curve. We came around that section just past 2:30 in the morning. The lights from the rear window of the train stretched ahead into the tunnel, catching the tracks and glinting off the curved steel as the car rumbled forward. I had been looking out into the dark, not expecting anything unusual, when I saw a man standing along the left tunnel wall just ahead of the bend. He wasn't walking. He wasn't reacting to the noise or the oncoming lights. He was just standing there, facing straight ahead, angled slightly away from the tracks, his arms down at his sides, his posture still and fixed. His jacket had the old silver-yellow reflective pattern that the MTA had phased out years earlier. And for the briefest moment, the light from the train caught the material and lit it up in a sharp vertical streak. That moment didn't last long. No more than a second or two, before he was swallowed back into the tunnel's dark. And we passed him. I turned immediately, pressing my face against the glass, trying to catch another glimpse. But the angle had already shifted, and the curvature of the tunnel blocked the view. I didn't say anything to the others at first. It was the kind of thing that sat in the gut rather than the brain. Unsettling, but hard to explain, without sounding like you were letting the night play tricks on you. But later, when I mentioned what I had seen to one of the other guys who'd worked the same shift a few nights earlier, he described the exact same figure without me giving him any leading details. The limp, the jacket, the location, every detail matched. We didn't talk about it any further that night. Over the next few weeks, the sightings continued, and more workers began speaking up. One conductor said he had been running the loop when he saw the man walking along the tunnel edge and swore the figure stepped partially into the track bed right before the train reached him. He had hit the brakes hard enough to knock his elbow out of joint. He believed he had hit someone, felt a thud beneath the wheels, and came back shaken and pale. But when the area was inspected, there was no damage, no debris, no sign of anyone being struck, and no human remains. It was as though nothing had ever been there at all. Eventually, MTA management ordered a full inspection of the stretch where the figure had been repeatedly seen. The entrance to the maintenance tunnel in question had been locked up for years. A rusted iron gate, secured by a padlock no one seemed to have touched in a very long time, blocked the entry. A small group of us were assigned to assist with the inspection. We removed the lock and swung the gate open. And the hinge groaned in a way that made it clear nothing had disturbed it in a very long time. Inside, the tunnel was narrow and filled with the sour smell of oxidized metal and damp concrete. The air was heavier in there, warmer than the surrounding tunnel system, and the light from our flashlights bounced off flaking paint and old equipment that hadn't been used in decades. There were no signs of anyone having recently entered. No fresh footprints, no discarded items. Nothing had been moved. The layer of grime on the floor was even, undisturbed by foot traffic or motion. It was as though the place had remained completely still since the last time it had been officially used. The deeper explanation came when one of the supervisors, curious about the tunnel's history, started digging through archived work logs and accident reports. He eventually found a file buried in the 1974 maintenance records. A track worker named Richard Felton had been assigned to inspect a wiring issue in that same tunnel one night in late October. His shift had been arranged at the last minute, and due to a clerical oversight, no notice had been sent to the dispatch office. The tunnel had not been listed as occupied. A train had been routed through without warning. According to the old incident summary, Felton had not been struck by the train itself. He had made contact with an exposed third rail while working in low visibility and had been electrocuted instantly. His body had been found by a separate crew the following morning. The report described a zippered jacket still in place, tools scattered across the floor, and visible burns where the current had passed through. After the investigation concluded, the tunnel had been marked off for restricted use and sealed, though the closure had never been made official in public documentation. Knowing that history changed the way people talked about the sightings, there was no more speculation about vagrants or lost workers. Most of us stopped using that stretch of tunnel entirely. It wasn't just policy. No one wanted to be down there anymore. The conductors who passed through at night started turning off the lights in their cabs as they rounded the loop, claiming the figure only seemed to appear more clearly when the glare was strongest. Some of the older workers started leaving small objects near the tunnel mouth during their shifts. Coils of wire, old work gloves, even unopened packs of cigarettes. Not because they believed in ghosts, necessarily, but because they felt like something had been left unfinished, and they didn't know how else to acknowledge it. I left night operations a few months later and moved into a daytime scheduling role. But the memory of that figure stayed with me. On the few occasions I rode the 6 line afterward, I would always watch as we passed that section of tunnel. Once, during an especially late ride, I caught what looked like a pale reflection of a jacket strip standing just beyond the reach of the lights, motionless near the same wall where I'd seen him all those weeks before. I tried to tell myself it was nothing more than a reflection. Maybe the shine of exposed wiring or a misaligned panel. But the way it stayed still as we moved past. It felt too intentional to be a trick of the light. No one ever found evidence of another person in that tunnel. No security footage ever caught the figure clearly. But those who worked down there knew what they had seen. We all saw the same man, wearing the same jacket, moving with the same limp, always heading in the same direction, not searching, not wandering, not reacting, just continuing forward through the darkness, as though whatever job he had been sent down to do had never quite been completed. I spent most of my adult life in Moscow, long enough to memorize the feel and rhythm of the metro, as if it were an extension of the city's heartbeat. For over 5 years, I took the Blue Line to and from work, using the same sequence of stations at nearly the same time every night. My routine never changed. Arbatskaya to Park Pobedy. I left the office just past 10, walked the same streets, descended the same stairs, and waited under the same fluorescent lights. The underground system had become so familiar that I could map it out in my head without ever checking the posted diagrams. It was early November in 2015, the kind of night where the cold was already working its way into the seams of your clothing by the time you reached the platform. I had stayed at the office later than usual, helping 2 interns troubleshoot a back-end problem. And by the time I arrived at Arbatskaya, the station had mostly cleared out. The only sounds came from the distant shuffling of a cleaner and the occasional metallic clatter of a train somewhere farther down the line. The train that pulled in was one of the older models, gray, weathered on the outside, with that faint smell of worn upholstery and metal polish that never quite left the interiors. I stepped into the car furthest toward the back and took a seat near the window. The vinyl seat cover stuck a little to my coat as I leaned back. Inside the car, a handful of passengers were scattered across the benches. An older man in paint-stained overalls sat near the center, with a backpack slung across his lap. A young couple leaned shoulder to shoulder, half asleep with their eyes half closed. At the far end, a woman wearing a wool coat stared down at her cracked phone screen, swiping slowly with her gloved finger. Just before the doors closed at Kievskaya, a busker stepped in, carrying a battered guitar case. He wore a puffy coat and stood near the door without playing anything, just shifting his weight and tapping his foot to some private rhythm. Everything inside the train felt completely normal. I didn't feel tired. I hadn't been drinking. I wasn't distracted or even particularly preoccupied. I sat there, watching the tiled tunnel blur past the window as we moved toward Park Pobedy. It was supposed to be the next stop. That much I remember clearly. It had always been the next stop. But instead of slowing down as we neared the familiar marker tiles, the train continued moving without any indication that it intended to stop. There was no chime, no voice over the speaker, no adjustment in speed. It simply kept moving deeper into the tunnel. At first, I thought I might have misjudged the distance, maybe gotten momentarily distracted. But more time passed, and still there was no sign of a station. I looked up at the LED display above the door, expecting to see the usual line of text indicating the upcoming stop. But the panel was completely blank. Not malfunctioning or frozen. It had been turned off entirely. I glanced around the car to see if anyone else was reacting, but the few passengers I had seen earlier were no longer in their seats. I scanned the entire compartment, expecting to see someone standing or moving to another section, but the train was entirely empty. The old man with the backpack was gone. The couple had disappeared. The woman with the phone had vanished. Even the musician near the door had disappeared without any trace. I hadn't seen or heard the doors open. There had been no shift in the car's motion, no footsteps, no sign of movement from anyone else. One moment they had been there, and the next, they were simply no longer present. I stood up, trying to make sense of what was happening. The silence inside the train had deepened. It no longer felt like the quiet of a late commute, but instead something much heavier, an unnatural stillness that pressed in around me. I walked toward the adjoining car, trying the metal handle of the door, but it was locked tight. Through the small window in the center, I could see the next carriage, though it was also entirely empty and poorly lit. The lights in that section flickered erratically, casting irregular shadows across the vacant seats. I turned to the emergency intercom and pressed the call button. A burst of static crackled to life, followed by a persistent, hollow hiss. I waited, hoping for some kind of operator response, but the sound remained unchanged no matter how long I held the button. There was no acknowledgement, no voice, nothing but the low, mechanical whisper of a dead connection. The train had not slowed once since leaving Kayevskaya. There was no indication of where it was going or if it would ever stop. The darkness outside the windows had become absolute. There were no passing lights, no tile markers, just uninterrupted blackness sliding by like a solid wall. Eventually, the train began to decelerate. Not in the usual way, with the sound of brakes groaning against the rails or the familiar jerk forward. This was smooth. Too smooth, as if the train were coasting to a stop in complete silence. It glided forward with no mechanical sound at all. When the doors opened, the platform beyond them was like nothing I had ever seen on any Moscow metro line. The station looked decades older than it should have. It didn't have the pristine polish or classical arches I was used to. The floor tiles were fractured and covered in a fine layer of dust. The walls, originally tiled in what must have been a pale ceramic, were now stained with long streaks of brown and gray, like years of water damage had gone unchecked. Pieces of the wall had crumbled away entirely, exposing rough cement and rusted steel supports underneath. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered erratically, bathing the entire platform in a weak, uneven glow. There were no advertisements, no digital signs, no posted maps or directional arrows. Not a single name was printed on any surface. I stepped out onto the platform, driven by some mix of confusion and unease. The air smelled stagnant and bitter, the way sealed basements smell when first opened. I scanned the far end of the platform, hoping to find an exit or a staircase. But there were no visible points of access. No elevators, no turnstiles, nothing that marked the place as functional or finished. The structure felt incomplete, as if construction had been abandoned halfway through and no one had ever returned. When I turned back toward the train, the doors had already closed. I approached the window, intending to wave or shout, but the glass had turned completely black. I pressed my hand to it, expecting to feel the warmth of the interior or catch a glimpse of light, but there was nothing behind it at all. No sense of depth, no outlines of seats or controls. Just a blank pane, cold and dark. Without warning, the train began moving again. There was no noise, no sound of the wheels turning or engines engaging. It simply began to roll forward and disappeared into the tunnel, leaving me alone on a platform I couldn't identify. I remained still for a while, listening. The silence in that place was total. Not even the faint rumble of distant trains passed through. I tried calling out into the tunnel, hoping to hear some echo or response, but my voice seemed to vanish into the air. With no map, no signage, and no obvious way out, the only option left was to walk along the tracks. I made my way to the tunnel beyond the platform's edge and started walking slowly, trying to remain close to the side where maintenance crews typically place access walkways. My phone's flashlight provided just enough visibility to avoid stepping on the rails or slipping on loose gravel. The tunnel walls were uneven and discolored, streaked with grime and punctuated by old, rusted brackets that held long dead cables. Every now and then, I passed what looked like abandoned maintenance tools or collapsed storage crates, covered in a thick layer of dust. None of it looked recent. Everything gave the impression of a place untouched for years. Occasionally, I thought I heard distant noises. At one point, it sounded like a slow tapping coming from somewhere ahead. Metal against stone, measured and deliberate. Once or twice, I stopped and held my breath. But the sound never returned when I tried to listen for it directly. After nearly an hour of walking, I saw movement ahead. Two beams of light swayed in the dark. They belonged to two metro workers, both wearing reflective safety vests and carrying flashlights. I approached them quickly, feeling a flood of tension break loose the moment I realized they were real. They looked puzzled when they saw me, and more so when I tried to explain where I'd come from. One of them asked which direction I'd come from, and when I described the station, he furrowed his brow. According to both of them, there was no station in that direction. There had never been a platform or a planned expansion project anywhere near that section of tunnel. They led me back through a series of service corridors until we emerged at a gated maintenance exit. One of the workers radioed in what had happened, stating that I'd been found walking inside a sealed section of the line with no authorized access. I repeated my story again at the surface level to a security officer, and later I filed a formal report with the Metro Authority. I gave them every detail I could recall: departure time, train number, car position. But when they attempted to pull the surveillance footage from that night, they informed me that the system had been undergoing maintenance and no usable video had been captured. The logs for that section of the line showed nothing out of the ordinary. I stopped taking the blue line after that. I moved across the city, took a different job, and arranged my commute to avoid the metro altogether. In the months that followed, I searched every archived map and construction plan I could find. None of them showed any evidence of an unfinished or abandoned station along that stretch of tunnel. Whatever place I'd arrived at that night wasn't supposed to be there. It wasn't documented. It wasn't named. It wasn't acknowledged. Sometimes, late at night, I still find myself thinking about the platform, the flickering lights, the crumbling walls, and the silent train disappearing into the dark. Whatever happened beneath Moscow that night wasn't a glitch or a misunderstanding. I had stepped into a place that didn't belong to the system I knew. And for reasons I may never understand, it had let me in. Back in the winter of 1999, I was working the night shift at a warehouse near Midland Avenue, just a short walk from Lawrence. Every evening ended the same way. I'd pack up, nod to the security guard on my way out, and start the slow walk to the Kennedy subway station to catch the last eastbound train on Line 3. I had no car at the time, and I couldn't afford cabs, so the TTC was all I had. I didn't mind it. The city was different at that hour. Muted, still, as if even time itself had wound down for the night. I came to appreciate the quiet that late-night commuting offered, especially on the Scarborough RT, which usually felt more like a private shuttle than a public train once midnight neared. The third car from the front had become my usual spot. Not too close to the operator's cab, not too isolated in the rear. It always felt balanced somehow. That night, just before 11:40, I boarded as usual and took a seat along the side wall near the middle of the car. The train had already started moving when I noticed how few people were with me. Aside from myself, there were no more than 4 or 5 other passengers, each absorbed in their own world, heads bowed over their laps or turned toward the darkened windows. The only person who stood out at all was a woman wearing a dark green coat, seated 2 rows ahead on the opposite side. She was probably in her early 30s, and like the rest of us, she carried that hollowed-out look shared by people who worked too long and slept too little. The train passed through the initial stretch smoothly, the track groaning beneath us with the usual complaints. Outside, the world was reduced to vague shapes and amber streetlights, distorted through fogged windows and patches of graffiti-smeared glass. We were somewhere between Kennedy and Lawrence East when everything changed. Without any build-up or warning, the woman suddenly rose from her seat, her movements stiff and unnatural, as if her muscles were responding to some internal jolt none of us could hear. She grabbed one of the upright poles with both hands, gripping it so tightly that the skin on her knuckles looked stretched and pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting. At first, I thought she was sick or dizzy and trying to steady herself. But then she began to scream. The sound didn't come out all at once. It started with a strained, almost choked gasp, followed by a sudden, piercing shriek that made every head in the car turn toward her. Her scream didn't stop after the first outburst. It only grew louder and more ragged, tearing through the silence in bursts so sharp they felt physically jarring. She shouted phrases I couldn't make sense of at first. Her voice cracked and uneven. But after a few repetitions, I began to understand what she was saying. Over and over, she kept shouting that something was coming, that we shouldn't let it take her. She kept her eyes fixed on the far end of the car, staring intently through the rear doors. I turned and followed her gaze, expecting to see someone, another passenger, a threat. Maybe something as mundane as a disturbed person moving through the train. But there was no one there. The rear of the car was completely empty. There was only the faded emergency signage, a convex mirror mounted near the ceiling, and one of the overhead lights that flickered inconsistently, as if it couldn't decide whether to stay on or go out entirely. The way she stared at that space, unblinking and rigid, unsettled me more than the screaming. There was a look in her eyes that I hadn't seen before. Something deeper than panic. It was as if she was looking at something that didn't belong in this world, something so wrong that her mind couldn't quite process it without coming apart. Her voice rose again, raw and uneven, her arms trembling violently as she pointed toward the empty rear of the car. She was no longer pleading with us. Her words had turned into something closer to a warning, although none of us knew what we were being warned against. A man seated across the aisle cautiously stepped forward, trying to speak to her. He moved slowly, his hands out in a calming gesture. But she recoiled instantly as he approached, her screaming intensifying, as if his presence had somehow drawn the thing she feared closer. She backed away from him until she collided with one of the side doors, where she stood for a brief moment, panting heavily, and still clutching the pole with one arm. Her other arm remained outstretched, fingers trembling, eyes locked onto the same point in space. That was when the train came to a sudden halt. There had been no announcement from the operator and no sign that we were nearing a station. The wheels groaned against the track with a shrill, metallic grind as the car rocked forward slightly before settling. Whether someone had pulled the emergency alarm or the operator had triggered the stop from the front, I never found out. But it didn't matter. The moment the train stopped moving, the woman's body gave out. She collapsed in a way that didn't look natural, like something inside her had simply shut off. Her hand slipped away from the pole and her legs crumpled beneath her. She hit the floor hard, the side of her face bouncing lightly against the rubber mat. Her limbs twitched once, then fell still. She lay there completely motionless. I stepped toward her, along with another woman who had been sitting closer. But before we reached her, the train doors opened and 2 uniformed EMS personnel stepped in. I don't remember hearing them arrive. They moved quickly and with practiced ease, their hands already reaching for the equipment strapped to their sides. One of them knelt beside the woman while the other cleared space around her. There were no cries for help, no shouting, no panicked orders. It was quiet now, eerily so, except for the low murmur of the EMT's voice as he checked for a pulse. The woman's eyes were still open, unblinking and glazed, staring upward with no recognition of the people around her. Her breathing was shallow but steady, her body limp and unresponsive. The EMTs loaded her onto a stretcher, speaking in hushed tones into a portable radio, then wheeled her through the open doors. None of the passengers said anything. No one tried to follow. We all just stood there, watching silently as the last trace of the incident was taken away. It was as if none of us knew what to do or say. We were all waiting for someone to explain it, someone with authority, someone who could make sense of what we had just seen. But that explanation never came. We were instructed to disembark at Lawrence East shortly afterward. The train pulled in slowly, and a TTC supervisor was already waiting on the platform, speaking into a radio while watching each of us step out. I didn't ask any questions, and no one offered answers. I looked back once as the train doors closed, and noticed that the light in the third car had begun to flicker again, more rapidly now, casting uneven shadows that stretched and shrank across the scratched walls. Days passed before I heard anything more. I found no news reports about the woman, no public statements from the TTC, no official follow-up. It wasn't until a month or so later that I heard a rumor from someone I knew who worked at a nearby hospital. He told me that the woman had remained catatonic for several weeks and had died unexpectedly without regaining consciousness. The doctors listed cardiac arrest as the cause of death, though no heart condition had ever been identified. There was nothing in her file that explained why her body simply failed. There were other rumors too, more unsettling ones. A few TTC workers began mentioning something about the security footage from that night. Apparently, the cameras inside the train car had malfunctioned during the exact window of her breakdown. 38 seconds of video had been lost, wiped out without warning, with no sign of tampering or technical failure before or later. Some said it was just a coincidence. Others weren't so sure. In the months that followed, I started to hear things I had never heard before. Long-time transit employees spoke in hushed tones about sealed maintenance tunnels along Line 3, sections of the track that didn't appear on current maps, places closed off during early construction that no one bothered to document officially. One of them told me that near the bend between Kennedy and Lawrence East, there had once been a side tunnel meant for track access. It had been sealed decades ago, but sometimes people still claimed to hear movement coming from behind the old hatch. Footsteps, dragging sounds, faint metallic tapping, like something brushing against the inside of the wall. I didn't want to believe any of it. I told myself that what I saw that night was just a medical episode, a seizure, a hallucination, a tragic coincidence. But I kept remembering the look in her eyes before she collapsed. She hadn't been lost or confused. She had been afraid of something, something behind her, something none of us could see, but that she seemed absolutely certain was real. A few months later, I boarded a late-night train again, this time on a different route. As I sat in a nearly empty car, I glanced into the convex mirror above the rear door and thought I saw a figure standing at the far end of the train. Tall, unmoving, just barely visible in the flickering light. When I turned around, there was no one there. The mirror reflected only the emptiness behind me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I never took Line 3 again after that. Even long before they shut it down, I had already decided I was done with that route. Whatever happened that night in 1999 didn't end with the train stopping or the woman being taken away. Something else remained. Something that moved in the dark spaces between stations. Something that couldn't be recorded or explained. Something that might still be there, waiting for the next passenger to look too long into the mirror at the end of the car.